Hello, friends, and welcome to this edition of the Coming In for a Landing podcast. I am your host, Paul Hudrick. Oh boy, do we have a lot to talk about today. The James Harden trade that wasn't for the Sixers, and we're going to touch on a lot of other things, kind of mostly where this leaves the Sixers and kind of what are the next steps and where does this leave the Eastern Conference with James Harden going to the Nets. And we're going to touch on a lot of that. And I have a great co-host joining me coming back on the podcast, and that is the great Noah Levick, the legend. So glad that you are coming back on, my friend.
Grateful to be back on. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So if you've been living under a rock, I would imagine that if you listen to this podcast enough, you already know the news that James Harden will be a Brooklyn Net. He is not going to be a Philadelphia 76er. The Rockets get a nice draft haul for him. They get 4 first-round picks. One of them comes from the Milwaukee Bucks via Cleveland, a little complicated there. Then they also get 4 pick swaps with Brooklyn. So a lot of draft compensation. They also do get Victor Oladipo from the Indiana Pacers. So that's a nice little flyer they can take on a guy like that coming off an injury who was an all-star caliber player. Maybe you see how that works with him and John Wall. But again, draft compensation, I think, is the big thing of why the Rockets ultimately take this offer. No, I want to start with, because it just intensified yesterday. We saw on Tuesday night, James Harden, really that presser was pretty damning. And it seemed like I messaged you, I think, immediately and said, like, yeah, I think this is going down. Like, there's no way, there's no coming back from that at that point. And then you see he's not at practice. It starts intensifying. We're seeing all these reports coming out that Houston wants to get it done. And I guess from your perspective, was there a point in the day where you kind of said to yourself, like, holy shit, James Harden's going to be a Sixer?
Not that he was necessarily going to be, but there was a point, I believe, The Athletic, Sam Amick and Shams Charania said that it was going to culminate quickly. And just reading that and the tea leaves, I figured the Sixers would be the favorites for him, just given the fact that they could offer Ben Simmons, and all indications were that they were willing to do so, despite Daryl Morey saying otherwise publicly last month. So, I still thought the Nets were a formidable contender. But yeah, I think my gut feel at that point was the Sixers were a logical favorite for James Harden. Yeah.
I'll admit that I really thought I thought it was going to happen. And the main reason I thought it was going to happen is when you saw Mark Stein and just some of the more detailed reports he had of what they were trying to, it seemed like, and maybe I kind of misread, because there was obviously a lot flying, and maybe I kind of put too much, I don't want to say put too much stock into Mark Stein, because Mark Stein's a great reporter and he's, totally above reproach, but just the way he kind of worded it almost seemed like this was about to happen, but they were just haggling over some minor details. At least that's what it seemed. And obviously Tyrese Maxey was a huge sticking point of that. And I really thought that was it. I really thought, wow, James Harden is going to be a Sixer, and they're just working at the last minute details. Didn't work out that way. When I saw the Shams tweet that it was James Harden to Brooklyn, I was personally shocked. I knew that obviously Brooklyn was in it. They were in it all day. It was Nets and Sixers, and they were both in it all along, really. And that was always Harden's preferred destination. But after seeing Stein's tweets and the way that seemed like it was progressing, I really thought he was coming here. But that leads me into the next point. I'm curious what you think, based on the tea leaves and kind of what we see in all the reports that were out there. And again, we're guessing, guys, because like we don't have intimate knowledge, at least as of now, about how these negotiations went. But what do you think was kind of the sticking point of this? If you listen to Stein, it seemed like maybe it was Tyrese Maxey. And I guess we can get more into what that all means. But what do you think was the main sticking point in the deal?
Well, there are two sides here. Daryl Morey didn't leave Houston on great terms, and you assume that was somewhat of a factor here in terms of just the Rockets' willingness to do a deal with the Sixers and what price they would have deemed sufficient. But yeah, as you said, based on Mark Stein's reporting, the Sixers didn't want to include Tyrese Maxey and were perhaps trying to figure out other ways to make a deal happen centered around Simmons, Matisse Thybulle, and draft picks. So the way I read it is Houston determined that a deal that was less than Simmons, Maxey, Thybulle, and multiple first-round picks was less appealing than Brooklyn's ultimate offer, and that's. I think there's reason to think that that's a decent decision. I think also from Houston's perspective, Ben Simmons is a player that could have been a franchise alterer, franchise builder, but they maintain a lot of flexibility here. Victor Oladipo is an expiring deal, could be flipped for another star perhaps as part of a larger package. So I think Houston did okay here. And they had some really difficult decisions to make, and it was all happening in this really dramatic, short, intense time period. So yeah, perhaps more details will trickle out, but based on what we've seen from reputable reporters, I think that's kind of approximately what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of really good points. I do, yeah. The Tillman Fertitta Daryl Morey factor has to be something, right? I mean, that's not nothing. That's something that we have to look at because James Harden wasn't getting moved without Tillman Fertitta signing off on the ultimate deal. And you never know. I mean, maybe Stone liked that deal. Maybe Stone liked Ben Simmons, Matisse Thybulle, and 2 picks, but Tillman Fertitta said no. I want more, and that kind of is what it is. And I think you wonder if Maxey kind of ruined Morey's negotiating power by going out and scoring 39 points last week and just really showcasing himself for what he could potentially be and really making it for Houston to really want him included in the deal. You put me on the spot earlier when you and I were talking, and I'm going to put you on spot on the podcast. And that is that would that have been a sticking point for you? Would you have done a deal that was Ben Simmons, Matisse Thybulle, the 2 draft picks plus Maxey, or would that? Because listen, you have to have a walking away point, right? Like you can't just say no. We'll do whatever it takes. There's got to be a point where you tell yourself no, like we can't do this. We have to walk away. Would that have been it for you? Would Tyrese Maxey being included in that deal, would that have been too much?
I think I'd probably lean toward yes, with the caveat, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, that these deals don't happen in a vacuum, and there is intel that Daryl Morey and the Sixers front office has that we do not possess, as far as would a Bradley Beal deal be doable down the line? Might PJ Tucker be a player that they could acquire for a very cheap price and make a pretty decent upgrade over Mike Scott there? So I think there are factors that make me hesitant to say anything with incredible confidence, but I would probably lean toward that being a little bit too much. I mean, my overall feeling on the situation is it's not a no-brainer anyway. Like, there are a lot of pros of James Harden as a historically great offensive player who would have helped the Sixers in areas where they really need assistance, would have been, on paper at least, an incredible compliment to Joel Embiid. But there's uncertainty here as far as some of the locker room accountability stuff, where his track record is checkered. And it would have been a deal with the short term in mind, because you're talking about 2 years under contract and then his player option. So I think it's entirely fair to think that maintaining flexibility and having Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid under contract through 2023 means the Sixers are still in a pretty solid position. But it's a really tough one for me, where the stance I disagree with most is like they were idiots for not going all in,
Yes.
or vice versa. I think it's a really complicated situation. Yeah.
Yeah, and the one message that I really wanted to get across to Sixers fans is I think you have to trust Daryl Morey. If there is one person who knows James Harden in all capacities, at least as far as executive goes, it's Daryl Morey. I mean, I don't think anyone knows more what makes James Harden tick, what's going on in kind of his psyche right now, what's going on in his basketball world right now. I think Daryl Morey would have a better pulse on that than just about anyone. And you also, I mean, not that I have much room to comment on someone's weight, but it does not appear that James Harden is also in the greatest of basketball shape. He didn't play well either. The last few games that they've played, he has not, and he's looked disinterested. Um, maybe that all changes. Maybe maybe he goes and plays for Brooklyn and scores 50 points in his first game. I mean, because it seems entirely possible. I remember Mark Jackson telling me a story on the Sixers Talk podcast back in the day that Allen Iverson, at one point they were on a road trip and it was a West Coast trip, and he told the coaches ahead of time, just find me now because I'm not showing up to practice for 2 days. And then he goes out and drops 40 points. So I mean, some of these guys, like a guy like Harden, I think fits that kind of description of Iverson, where he can just go out and just score, and he's just he can just get off a bus and do that. So as I do, but I think all the points you raise are fair. Of course, a super amount of pros in that he's just such a great offensive basketball player and can open up so much for Joel Embiid, because you can't double both of them. That's not going to happen. Like you have to, and then on top of that, their spacing is already better this year, the Sixers. So you couple that with having Harden and Embiid, and it puts defenses would have been in a really tough situation on determining how you kind of guard those guys. But yeah, the cons. I mean, it's no secret that James Harden isn't the most, hasn't always gotten along with others. You see what happened with Chris Paul, what happened back in the day, even with Dwight Howard. It's just, he doesn't seem like he's always been a compatible guy with other players. We'll see what happens at Brooklyn, because that dynamic is going to be, I mean, interesting is an incredible understatement when you factor in Harden, Durant, and Kyrie, and how that's all going to work. I'm very intrigued to see how that goes. But what you mentioned a couple things that I want to get back to, and I really want to talk about. First thing is Bradley Beal, and that's a guy that now it seems like that's going to be the next guy. Like Harden was the guy that everyone was focused on, not just the Sixers, the NBA. Harden was the guy that everyone was really focused on as the next superstar to get traded. He gets traded. Now we're at a point where Bradley Beal, having had a great season last year, is having an unbelievable season this year. The top scorer in the NBA right now, dropped 60 on the Sixers not that long ago. And you look at Washington's situation, and it's not great. They make the trade with Westbrook and Wall, and it looks like so far the Rockets are getting the better end of that, because Westbrook's shot has just, not that it was ever great, but it is just deteriorated, and he's just really struggling. He's hurt now. So we'll see. Maybe he gets healthy and he gets, a little bit better, but that trade is not looking great. And you look at the rest of the roster, and it's just, they're young. When you look at, Denny Avita, I mean, I love that guy. I think he's going to be really good, but he's 21 years old. I mean, he's got a lot of development to go. Rui Hachimura, same boat. He's got promise. He looks good, but he's still so young. Thomas Bryant now is out for the season, but he's another guy, young, a little bit on the younger side, not really on, like Beal is 28 years old. Like you talk about like windows and guys needing to win. That window isn't getting any bigger for Bradley Beal in Washington. So I guess a couple layers for Bradley Beal is, one, do you think, we'll start with, do you think that's realistic? Do you think at some point the Wizards would explore trading Bradley Beal? I know Kevin O'Connor from The Ringer had a piece about it, John Hollinger from The Athletic as well. So I'll start there. Do you think that at some point the Wizards get to a point where they'd look at offers for Bradley Beal?
I think that's realistic. Yeah. With Beal, I mean, I would think if he expresses a desire to be in a better situation, that they would be amenable to such a request, given what you say about how this is such a young team that doesn't really seem to match up with his timeline. And because he's playing so well, they should be able to get a pretty substantial haul in return for him. So yeah, I think it's entirely realistic, especially if, as the Sixers reportedly have already done with James Harden, a player like Ben Simmons is on the table, who's a few years younger than Bradley Beal. He's 24, and
Longer
again,
contract too.
yeah, under a contract for a really long time. So yeah, I think that is very, very much on the table before the March 25th trade deadline. Yeah.
And I guess I listen, and I think you and I will both fully admit that Derek Bodner is a lot smarter than both of us. But he put out a tweet that was interesting to me, where he said that kind of like Bradley Beal and James Harden kind of aren't that close. And while I agree that James Harden is better and it like is a better basketball player and gets you more championship, it makes you a finals contender kind of immediately. You get James Harden, but Bradley Beal, I still think like, yeah, he's not that up to that level, but he's still really freaking good. And I just imagine Beal and Embiid together, and it leaves defenses in still a really similar bind, because you can't, if you double team Joel Embiid and you leave Bradley Beal, he's going to kill you. And so, and like the Sixers just witnessed it not that long ago. So I think, and I also think there is something to the idea of, look, Bradley Beal isn't going to go to a strip club maskless. He's not going to chuck basketballs at rookies, and he's not going to publicly say that his team stinks. Like, I don't think Bradley Beal is that type of guy. So I think, and then I also, the way Bradley Beal plays, I think you could, it might, there's an argument that it could mesh better with Joel Embiid, because maybe they could play off each other more. Maybe they can do some of that dribble handoff stuff that kind of JJ Redick and Joel Embiid did. And that could kind of basically think about putting Beal in that kind of action with Joel Embiid. You couldn't stop it with JJ Redick. You ain't stopping it with Bradley Beal at the helm of that. So, but I also think at the same time that the idea that Beal, like you already said, he hasn't asked for a trade. He doesn't seem like he's demanding one even remotely, and he doesn't seem the type of personality that's going to start acting out or lashing out if things don't really go his way. So then I wonder at what point, what would be the breaking point for the Wizards. I think in Hollinger's piece, I think he kind of brought up the idea that if the Wizards were smart, that's why they would do it now, because his value is only going to decrease the longer you wait. And because he's not doing any of that stuff that Harden was doing, that puts his value higher. And he's obviously younger, 2 years left, a similar contract in that he's got 1 year this year, next year, and then a player option for a third. But yeah, I to me, Bradley Beal 100% makes them at the very least a strong candidate to represent the Eastern Conference in the finals. I don't know how you feel about that.
Depends on your exact phrasing. Yeah, strong candidate's fair.
Strong candidate, yeah, like not a favorite for
I think if they had acquired James Harden, most people would have considered the Sixers the favorites to win the East. I think
Agreed.
that's fair. But yeah, with Beal, something I wasn't super aware of is just how good he is at creating offense for himself. I think I kind of got this perception in my head when he was with John Wall that he was good at playing off ball dominant players, which is the case. But yeah, only 45% of his made field goals have been assisted this year, which is a pretty low number.
That's a good pull by you. That's a good stat.
Yeah, per cleaning glass. So yeah, that actually surprised me. I do think I'd really be curious if they were to acquire Beal, like is Tyrese Maxey or starting point guard? Assuming Simmons is part of that deal, I guess probably.
Or you could have Seth Curry do it, and Bradley Beal will just leave. I mean, because I think, not to interrupt you, but I just think that you could make it work. If you started Bradley Beal and Seth Curry as like your starting backcourt, I think you could make that work without a traditional point guard. But yeah, continue, please.
Yeah, you could probably make it work. And then defensively, there would be real concerns there, I guess, assuming Danny Green stays on the roster. He's your best perimeter slash wing defender. He's a solid defender, but Bradley Beal scored 60 points on him. Um, so there are real deficiencies in that case. I think it's still a roster with glaring weaknesses in terms of like that backup power forward spot, which is Mike Scott currently. Maybe you'd try to find a way to make another move there. I do think that this is not having intimate personal knowledge of Beal and Harden, but that perhaps if the Sixers were to acquire Beal, that he'd be a little more likely to stay here long term, maybe even for the rest of his career, just based on his personality, as you said, which seems rather non-confrontational, and the fact that if things were to go okay in those first couple years, and this team was to make a finals or something like that, I think he'd have every reason to want to stick here, being 27 years old and thinking, okay, the first few years of my prime with the Sixers went really well, and now kind of maybe in the later half of my prime, I stay here and try to keep a good thing going with Joel Embiid. So I think that's another factor to take into consideration. But I would agree with Derek Bodner's point, at least in the sense that there's a real disparity between like this individual offensive machine who isolates last year more than any single team in the NBA and did it at this incredibly high efficiency, and a very good offensive player who isn't good defensively and hasn't come even as close as James Harden to winning a title. And I guess for a lot of people with James Harden, that has been a big knock of like he hasn't had the playoff success in terms of like winning a championship. That is very much also true for Bradley Beal. So acquiring James Harden wouldn't have made the Sixers a sure thing to win the Eastern Conference. And I'd say the same thing is true to a much, much greater degree with Bradley Beal. But it's a move that I figure would potentially put them in a pretty good position for the long term, is kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Like I would say the way I would kind of word it is I think Bradley Beal is a great offensive player. James Harden is a historically great offensive player. It's just there's really no parallel for James Harden, at least in recent NBA, like the last whatever. I mean, maybe Kevin Durant would be kind of in that mix as far as just pure ability to score the basketball. There's really not too many guys that can go to that level. And the other thing about Bradley Beal too, that I think is slightly listen, James Harden creates offense for others too. He does. I mean, there was a year, it wasn't that long ago that I think he had like 11 assists a game in a season. So, I mean, he does that as well. Bradley Beal, it's not that he can't do that. Like not maybe again, not to the level of Harden, but the guy averages 5 assists a game. And that's with, again, surrounded by not the greatest supporting cast. Like if you put him with Joel Embiid, that could easily go up to 7 or 8 assists, I would think. And again, surrounded by Seth Curry and Danny Green and Tobias Harris and those type of shooters, I could easily see him bumping those assists up. I will say too, I like Bradley Beal's not a good defender, just flat out. He is not. When we talk about effort level, though, I would definitely argue that Bradley Beal at least seems to care on that end. Whereas James Harden, we could definitely make the argument that he doesn't always. So that would be a factor for me as well. So I think off of, and I think we're both agreeing here that like sheer talent and offensive ability, just ability to just score the basketball at will. Yes, James Harden over Bradley Beal. And it goes back to when we talk about pros and cons with Bradley Beal, the pros are younger, more, would seem to be would fit in better, would just fit. And that's not just the Sixers. I think Bradley Beal just would fit in better anywhere, because I just think his game fits anywhere. So yeah, I think we're semi on the same page there. It's just like not wouldn't put them like I would agree that it makes them the favorite. It would have made them the favorite if they had gotten James Harden. Bradley Beal doesn't make them the favorite, but I think he makes them a legitimate contender in the East, at least. Maybe not. Maybe they don't beat, that's way ahead. Maybe they don't beat the LA teams, but it makes them a team that could match up against the Bucks, could match up maybe potentially against the Nets. But moving on from Beal, but sticking kind of in that same vein, you also mentioned PJ Tucker earlier, and also the need to possibly upgrade that power forward spot coming off the bench. I still feel like, and you can agree or disagree, I still feel like there are moves Morey can make that wouldn't be a Bradley Beal or, whatever, a Zach LaVine or whatever kind of blockbuster kind of player, but moves he can make around the margins that could represent significant upgrades and still maybe kind of vault them into that conversation as one of the better teams in the East.
Yeah, and just as you're talking, I do think it's important to say that we don't know whether the roster as currently constructed is one of the better teams in the East. Like, they look pretty good before Curry's positive COVID-19 test. They were 7-2, and you saw a lot of potential in that starting lineup. And now we're in a situation where many teams across the league have been heavily affected by COVID-19. You have the Celtics with their last 3 games postponed as of our recording this podcast. You have the Heat, who are playing a mini series against the Sixers with 8 players, which is pretty absurd. And no Jimmy Butler, no Bam Adebayo. So it's very hard to make assessments of teams at this stage, and that is something Daryl Morey didn't predict these exact circumstances, but he did acknowledge, I remember in his introductory press conference, that there's something to be said for letting a season play out and seeing what you have before making any gargantuan moves like a James Harden trade would have been, like a Bradley Beal trade would be. To a certain extent. So I think it's just important to acknowledge that. But yeah, this is a similar point on, are there kind of marginal or slightly greater than marginal moves that can be made? I think, yeah, PJ Tucker is someone who immediately comes to mind. I know The Athletic has reported that he is expected to be available, and he's also very unhappy to still be in Houston. We were talking earlier about Patty Mills, who Kevin O'Connor had reported in the offseason.
Love Patty Mills.
Yeah, Kevin O'Connor had reported that a Josh Richardson, Patty Mills deal of some kind was on the table. You'd figure ahead of the trade deadline, the Spurs would remain open to dealing Patty Mills, and he's appealing for a lot of reasons in terms of shot making, speed, by all accounts, a really great locker room veteran. And so yeah, that's one possibility. And there are a lot of things I would think could be on the table, just in terms of, you have most of your taxpayer mid-level exception. They used a small chunk to sign Isaiah Joe, but a little less than $5 million there. So you can potentially wait to see whether there's someone who emerges on the buyout market for around that price or a little less. And I think that's very much in play. You also have an $8.2 million trade exception from the Al Horford deal, which could be relevant with Tucker, could be relevant with other players. So yeah, I mean, if we know anything about Daryl Morey, it's that he's not going to sit on his hands. He's going to explore everything out there. So even in a scenario where the Sixers team that enters the playoffs is similar to the one we're talking about on January 14th, there will be a lot of probing up until that point.
Yeah, and I look at it like, sure, if you can get Bradley Beal, go get Bradley Beal. That would be great. He's an improvement. and he clearly put you up a notch in the Eastern Conference. But that's not to say you can't make what we would call, a smaller deals and still not make a significant upgrade to your roster overall. Um, eh, if you keep the main pieces intact, and again, there's no inclination this is definitely happening or anything like that, but there is a pathway that you have enough pieces to trade. And like you already talked about with the mid-level exception, and with the trade exception, you could theoretically trade for a PJ Tucker and or a Patty Mills. And just think about what that does to your bench, and what that upgrading from PJ Tucker, from Mike Scott to PJ Tucker, and the significance of that, and then upgrading from, let's say a Furkan Korkmaz to a Patty Mills. I mean, those are not little upgrades. Like, that's a big deal. And then on top of it, not only from a talent perspective, because I think they're both just better players, man, like, that dude is a winner. Like, he just does so many little things, does all that dirty work. Like, glue guy is an understatement when you talk about PJ Tucker. He just does all of those things that help a team win basketball games. And the same really for Patty Mills. And he's a leader. He's won championships. He's a leader for Team Australia as well. And with the things he's done off the court with social injustice and all that kind of thing. Like, he is such a prominent figure and could just help a team so much. Like the Sixers, who are, for lack of a better term, trying to figure out how to win and get to that next level and become that upper echelon team. So as much as maybe from the outside, you look at those trades and they're not nearly as sexy as Brad Beal, it's still a pretty significant upgrade to your roster. And then I think you make an excellent point too with the buyout market. When you have a little bit of that extra money to play with that taxpayer mid-level exception, that maybe make, if an attractive player does come available in the buyout market, you have a little bit more money to offer them, maybe more than some other quote unquote contenders. And that could be a really big help. But I want to talk about right now, I guess we can kind of close it out by having this kind of bigger discussion about where the Sixers are right now. And I agree with you that it's so hard to know the East hierarchy right now, because just so much is a mess with the COVID protocol, and with, you mentioned the Celtics, the Heat, and all these other teams, and the Sixers obviously going through this. And the Sixers were rolling. I mean, let's just like call it like we see it. They were rolling before that. And you can't tell me that night in Brooklyn, when they find out Seth Curry tests positive in the first quarter, that didn't have a mental impact on them for the rest of the game, because clearly it does. And so, but just to kind of put a bow on everything, with Ben Simmons, I guess we'll start there. Do you think the Sixers, I mean, we've talked to Ben Simmons a bunch about this kind of stuff, the trade rumors and all that, and he's kind of had a similar response. I think a very good professional response. Do you think there needs to be any kind of conversation with Ben Simmons, considering at this point it looked pretty damn close and he was out there for James Harden?
From what we understand, that situation is pretty solid. I know Mark J. Spears of ESPN reported Simmons was ecstatic, actually. And yeah, Doc Rivers, a while back when there was some buzz about this, said he had a conversation with Ben and it went well, and there's a mutual understanding that it's part of the business. So from what I can tell, there's a decent sense from all parties that this is how things work. And I would assume Ben Simmons respects that James Harden is a great player, and it's inevitable that trade discussions happen in the NBA when great players are available. More broadly with Ben Simmons, I mean, which we haven't really touched on, it does put greater pressure on him, whether it's internal or external or both, arguably. I mean, look, offensively, he hasn't been too good through 10 games this season. He did miss 2 games with left knee swelling, and the Sixers were actually fine for not listing him on the injury report for that almost farcical Nuggets game that took place on Saturday. But, prior to that, offensively, he was turning the ball more than he ever has, and he was scoring less efficiently than he ever has. And those are two areas where it's pretty important that he develops, or at least does not stagnate or regress. And as we've talked about many, many times, there are ways to happen that potentially include 3-point shooting, but there are also ways that could include getting to the foul line more often, making free throws, finishing efficiently around the rim. And he's not checking those boxes early in the season. And I think it's really important for him to do some of those things when the playoffs arrive. Again, we don't want to neglect that he's a great defender, that what he does kicking out to this new arsenal of 3-point shooters is really important. That the Sixers have looked really dangerous in some of these games when he's just running and tossing passes behind his back to Steph Curry. And it's been a lot of fun before these health and safety concerns kind of put a halt to everything. But just calling it like it is, yeah, he needs to become a better offensive player in all likelihood if this team is going to, win the Eastern Conference or something along those lines. But yeah, it's the whole NBA COVID situation. It's messy. It's really, really messy. And you get the sense that while the league has prepared and understood that positive tests were going to happen and the games would be postponed, that they weren't entirely equipped to deal with this. Like, we had these additional protocols coming out earlier this week, including that you can't have guests in your hotel rooms. Like, in all honesty, that probably should have been a protocol in the first place if the whole goal is to mitigate risk. And it's just a difficult balance here too, where you're talking about personal freedoms for players and also trying to still prioritize their health and safety. So yeah, I mean, it just, I don't know, feels important to say, just given all we've talked about regarding where the Sixers are and what could happen, like, none of this is guaranteed. Like, the Sixers game we watched Tuesday, I mean, it was super entertaining and exciting, and Joel Embiid scored 45 points and looked like an MVP, but they were playing against a team with 8 players, and a lot of their players were out too, including, after one of them, Seth Curry, tested positive for COVID-19. And COVID-19 is this virus that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. So yeah, let's hope that we can finish the season in somewhat normal fashion and people stay as healthy as possible.
Agreed big time on that. And I don't know what the league does. I mean, short of, like you said, some of these are like, well, why were they allowing guests in hotel rooms to begin with? Like, that just seems like a common sense thing that maybe they should have not been doing. And it's the kind of thing where I think you and I both had concerns about the bubble. And listen, for all intents and purposes, the bubble worked, and it worked well. And all the measures they took, all the things they did worked. So you would think the league that was smart enough to do that and put all that together would have maybe already been on top of some things like that. I mean, that is a really good example of something where, why wasn't that already in place?
Yeah,
And like,
just to briefly interrupt there, the Athletic, Jared Weiss and Tim Cato, I think, had a good story too on just the fact that it seems like the league didn't account for the notion of like in-game transmission, which to me is really troubling, and again, just contrary to common sense. So just that they recognize the CDC's definition of like being within 6 feet of someone for 15 or more minutes within a 24-hour period qualifies as close contact, but they don't consider basketball players sharing a ball and
sweating on each other.
sweating and all that qualifying, and that's just kind of baffling. And it's also troubling too, because I mean, as absurd as it might be, like we're talking about the health and safety not only of the players but about all the people they come into contact with.
Yep,
Uh,
100%.
so anyway,
Well, we got word that, there was a report that a member of the Sixers athletic training staff got a positive test. So that's what it is. It's not just the players; it's the people around them, and it is a virus. It spreads, and so it's not just about keeping the players safe and keeping them healthy. It's about keeping the rest of the staff healthy, keeping everyone's families healthy. Like that's how these things work, and that's how this has happened. So that's an excellent point as well. And it's just it's you and I talked about this before, and you made an excellent point that how lucky were they that Seth Curry had an ankle injury and couldn't play because he had a positive test and they didn't know until after the first quarter was over. If he didn't have an ankle injury, he would have started that game and played. And we don't know the extent to then of how that would have affected not only the Sixers, but the Brooklyn Nets players that they were playing. So it's so messy. And I don't know what they have to do, whether it's forcing guys to show up to the arena earlier or whatever. But my goodness, get results before game starts. I mean, because you saw it in Dallas as well with Maxi Kleba. I don't. His was in the second half. They didn't realize he had a positive test. Like that to me. That's I don't know about you, but like that's mind-boggling to me. Like that can't happen. I don't know what needs to change. I get it. The rapid tests aren't as rapid as maybe we all would like, but like figure it out. Like it's got either guys got to show up earlier or whatever. There's got to be a better system to ensure that guys that are positive aren't in the arena and playing basketball when this is going on. So yeah, we went off a little bit on that, but it's something that we have to talk about, and something that's like you said, it's not going away. It's going to impact this entire season because very easily another Sixer, God forbid, let's hope it doesn't happen, but another Sixer could test positive down the road, and then that leads to this all happening again. So it's going to be messy, and it's going to affect the season in a big way. But just to put a bow on this whole podcast, and just with the Sixers, and you mentioned Joel Embiid puts up 45 points the other night, and it wasn't just the 45 points; it was the way in which he did it, and where it was just this sense of, okay, we're not going to lose this game. Get on my back and like, let's go. Especially in that third quarter and then in overtime, there was that one play where he hits that fadeaway from the baseline. No, I swear to God, all 5 Heat players were surrounding him. He took a fadeaway and hit it. Like it was just one of those performances where it is MVP caliber, and it's mind-blowingly dominant. So it's something that people have brought up, and I just want to explore it a little bit. This seems like right now, Joel Embiid, and we've both watched Joel Embiid the last few years and have covered him. He is playing the best basketball of his career. Before everything happened, he was playing, to me, the smartest and most efficient basketball of his career. His mindset, even the way he's kind of carried himself, you see the maturity. And listen, things happen. Guys get older and they grow up and they mature. And then also he's now a father, and that's a factor in people's lives, and people change when that happens. So something that people have brought up, factoring all of that, is now the time where the Sixers just need to be all in and say, listen, Joel Embiid, he's a 7-footer. He's already got an injury history. And right now he's playing the best basketball of his career. He is in his prime. They need to capitalize this on right now. Do you subscribe to that? Or do you think that there needs to be some measure there and say like, well, yes, you want to improve the roster, you want to take advantage of it, but going all in could possibly sacrifice the future?
I subscribe to it to some extent. Like, again, returning to a hypothetical with Bradley Beal, I'd probably be willing to give a bit more up now than if Joel Embiid was a few years younger or not playing quite as well. I think there probably should be a little bit more urgency, but it's all about drawing that line and not being overly desperate or overly generous in what you gave up. And of course, all of that was presumably under consideration for Daryl Morey as well with James Harden. But yeah, I think it's valid. I think while Embiid, you're clearly seeing the benefits of him really, really focusing on his body and hiring, nutritionist and massage therapist and backing up some of the talk on that front. The reality is that, yeah, people who are his size, you can't be sure that they're going to have long NBA careers. And let's face it, like even this season, he's showing up on a lot of these injury reports. Like he's been probable with back tightness these last few games. He missed the Denver game with back tightness. He has these nagging injuries that mean that there's just this prevailing uncertainty around him. So I understand it. Again, I don't think it's something where it's necessarily right to draw a hardline stance of they've got to do everything they can to get Embiid a star. Like, well, if you're able to have the two current all-stars of Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid, but have that team be good enough to give Embiid a solid chance of winning a championship, then that's pretty good. And that very well might be the way to go. Is kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, and we haven't even touched on like Tobias Harris he's such an X factor for this team because he had been playing phenomenal before he got, quite frankly, like it was definitely the best we'd have seen of him as a Sixer before the COVID outbreak. So you gotta hope that he comes back and he plays a similar brand of basketball. And it's not necessarily like they don't need him to score 25 a game, but around 20 and playing that efficient brand, that decisive, efficient brand of basketball, I think is what would go the longest way. But we're going to wrap it up there. Noah, I can't thank you enough for coming on. Definitely make sure you follow Noah on Twitter at Noah Levick, and then also catch up on all of his latest articles at NBCSportsPhiladelphia.com. Levick the legend. Thank you. And thank you again, my friend. I appreciate it very much.
I appreciate it on this end as well. Thank you.
All right. I appreciate all you guys for checking out the Coming In for a Landing podcast. Please download, subscribe, rate, all that good stuff. I am your host, Paul Hudrick, and I will talk to you next time. All right.